How did you find out your best friend was the villain the whole time? At first, I felt guilty going to the town's Halloween party while my boyfriend was home sick, but that guilt instantly evaporated the second I actually spotted him, just a few feet away, kissing another girl. My best friend Lori gasped when she saw them, fighting back a smile, something I didn't even notice at the time. "Oh no, I'm so sorry. Don't worry, you'll find someone who will fit you more," she said, in a tone like she was holding back a laugh. She grabbed my arm and started dragging me towards them before I yanked it back. "We have to go confront him," she insisted. I shook my head, already biting back tears. "I can't," I told her before running off to disappear with the crowd. I don't remember walking to the dart booth, but suddenly I was there, grabbing darts and hurling them at balloons with way too much force. Pop, pop, pop. Each balloon felt like a tiny release of the anger building in my chest. "I've never met someone so excited about throwing darts," a voice said behind me. I turned to see a guy in a phantom mask leaning against the booth, laughing. "If only your aim matched your energy." I looked at the board where only 3 of my darts actually hit a balloon and frowned. "Thank you for the advice, but I actually missed on purpose." He grinned and held up his hands. "All right, you got me." He leaned over the counter and handed out a ticket to the staff. He started accurately popping each balloon in one go. "So, bad night?" I paused, rolling the dart in my hand. "Terrible. Worst night of my life, maybe," I said quietly. I started telling the masked stranger everything. The cheating boyfriend. The matching costumes. How stupid I felt. He listened to every word without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment before saying, "You know what the saddest part about this is?" I shook my head. "The worst part is you're blaming yourself. I can hear it in your voice. Like somehow you missed the signs or weren't enough." He stepped closer. "But the truth is, people who cheat aren't looking for something better. They're just looking for something easier. And that's on them, not you." I felt tears forming behind my mask. He smiled softly and added, "My mom cheated on my dad last year. Even now, he blames himself." We stood there in silence for a moment, the party noise fading into background static. "You want to know something crazy?" I asked. He nodded. "This is the first time tonight I haven't felt completely shattered." He smiled behind his mask. I don't remember who moved first, but the space between us disappeared and suddenly we were sharing a kiss under the moonlight. The sound of my midnight alarm pulled us apart. "Wait, your name," he said, grabbing hold of my hand. I shook my head. "I'm sorry this was wrong. I was heartbroken just an hour ago. Thank you for tonight." And I left him, thinking I'd never see him again. The next morning, Lori burst into my room and shoved her phone in my face. "Look at this! Isn't it romantic?" There were pictures of me and the guy with the mask spreading online through the community with the caption, "Looking for the girl from last night. Please contact me. Elliot." My heart nearly stopped at the name. Elliot? The mayor's son? The same Elliot who used to call me bookworm and knock my novels out of my hands in middle school before he transferred schools? "No way," I said flatly. "It can't be him. That guy last night was so sweet. The Elliot I knew was a little jerk face." Lori's eyes widened. "So are you gonna meet with him?" I shook my head no. She sighed in relief. "Good. You've just gotten over a guy. You can't just go and date another guy. It would be wrong. Plus, would he really be happy to know it's you?" I blinked at her harsh reaction. "Yeah," I mumbled. I spent the next 3 days avoiding those posters until Elliot walked into my family's bookstore looking for a gift for his mom. He glanced at me behind the counter and his face lit up with recognition. "Wait, you're that girl from middle school. The one who loved books." I felt my defenses go up. "You're the guy who made fun of me for it." "Yeah," he sighed. "I was a terrible kid. I'm really sorry about that. I was going through some stuff and I took it out on you." We talked for a bit and I realized he'd changed. He was softer now, kinder. When he was picking out books, I couldn't help myself. "So I heard you've been looking for someone." His expression shifted to something vulnerable. "Yeah, I met this girl on Halloween and I can't stop thinking about her. I know it sounds crazy, but when you connect with someone like that, even for just a moment, you know it means something. I've dated plenty of people, but that night was the most honest thing you've felt in your life." I finished for him. He paused and stared, surprised. But before I could open up, my best friend walked through the doors holding the mask I had worn on Halloween in her hand. "Oh, hey, Elliot. I've been meaning to reach out. I'm Lori, the girl you've been looking for." I stared at Lori in complete shock. She smirked at me. And soon, I'd find out the complete truth. What she did to get my ex-boyfriend to cheat. And how Elliot was the perfect tool to ensure I'd hurt forever. Or so she thought. I stood there completely frozen as Lori held up my mask like some kind of prize. Elliot's eyes moved between us, his face showing total confusion. My brain felt like it was short-circuiting trying to process what just happened. How could my best friend lie about being the girl from Halloween? What did she mean about making sure I hurt forever? Lori's smirk got wider as she watched me struggle to speak. Elliot reached for the mask to examine it closer, and I wanted to scream that it was mine, that I was the one he kissed, but my throat felt completely closed up. Lori stepped closer to Elliot and touched his arm in this possessive way that made my stomach twist. He smiled at her. still looking a bit confused but clearly wanting to believe her story. I managed to mumble something about needing to check inventory in the back and basically ran away from them. My hands were shaking, so bad I could barely turn the key to lock the stockroom door behind me. Through the door I heard them talking, heard Lori's fake, sweet laugh, heard the bell on the front door chime as they left together. I flipped the store sign to closed even though it was only 4 p.m. My parents would be mad, but I couldn't deal with customers right now. I sat on the floor in the back room surrounded by boxes of books and just replayed everything from Halloween in my mind. The way Lori had gasped when she saw my ex cheating, but now I remembered that weird smile she was fighting back. She'd said I'd find someone who would fit me better in this tone, like she was holding back a laugh. At the time, I thought I was imagining things because I was so upset. Then she'd grabbed my arm, trying to drag me toward my ex and that girl. She kept insisting we had to confront him right then. Why was she so determined to make me face it in that exact moment? I'd pulled away and run off into the crowd, and Lori had disappeared after that. I didn't see her again for the rest of the night. My phone buzzed, and I saw a text from Lori asking if I was okay and saying Elliot seemed really sweet. I stared at the message feeling sick. I scrolled through my contacts until I found Miranda Harvey's number. She'd been at the Halloween party and knew basically everyone there. I called her trying to sound casual and asked if she'd had fun at the party. We talked about costumes and music for a few minutes before I carefully brought up Lori. Miranda confirmed she'd seen Lori arrive really late, probably around 12:30 or 1 a.m. My heart started pounding because I'd met Elliot at the dart booth around 10:30, and we'd talked until midnight when my alarm went off. There was no possible way Lori could have been the girl with him. Miranda asked why I wanted to know, and I made up some excuse about trying to remember when I'd last seen Lori that night. After I hung up, I sat there staring at my phone with this growing feeling of dread. Lori had lied about being there during the time I was with Elliot. She'd lied directly to his face while holding my mask as proof. But why would she do that? What did she have to gain from pretending to be me? The next morning, I dragged myself to work at the bookstore even though I'd barely slept. Freya was already there restocking the fiction section when I walked in. She took one look at my face and asked what was wrong. I'd worked with Freya for 2 years, and she'd always been straightforward and honest, so I told her everything. About meeting the masked guy on Halloween, about Elliot searching for me, about Lori walking in yesterday with my mask and claiming to be the girl he was looking for. Freya's eyes got wider and wider as I talked. When I finished, she set down the book she was holding and said Lori might have done way more than just lie about Halloween. She asked if I'd thought about how my ex ended up at that party with another girl in the first place. The question hit me like a punch to the stomach because I hadn't really thought about it. My ex was supposed to be homesick. How did he end up at the party kissing someone else? Freya reminded me that Lori was the one who convinced me to go to the Halloween party without my boyfriend. She'd come over that afternoon and kept saying he wouldn't mind since he was sick, that I deserved to have fun, that I shouldn't miss the biggest party of the year just because he had a cold. At the time, it seemed like normal best friend encouragement. Lori was always pushing me to be more social and spontaneous, but now with everything else, it felt different. It felt planned. Freya suggested I look at my ex's social media to see if there were any photos from that night that might show when he arrived or who he was with. I pulled out my phone right there behind the counter, my hands shaking a little as I opened his profile. I hadn't looked at his page since we broke up because it hurt too much. I spent my whole lunch break in the stockroom scrolling through my ex's social media and the accounts of people who'd been at the party. Most of the photos were blurry shots of people in costumes dancing or playing games. I found one photo posted by some guy from my ex's friend group that showed a bunch of people near the entrance. The photo was time-stamped at 9:45, before I'd even arrived. I zoomed in on the faces, and my heart stopped. In the background, partially hidden by someone's vampire cape, I could see Lori talking to my ex. She was leaning in close like she was telling him something important, and his face looked serious. This was before he'd kissed that other girl. This was before I'd even gotten to the party. My hands started shaking as I zoomed in more, making sure it was really them. It was definitely Lori's costume and my ex's face. They were together at the party way earlier than Lori had claimed to arrive. My whole body felt cold as I realized what this meant. Lori had been at the party before she said. She'd been there talking to my ex before he cheated on me. She'd seen me arrive and found me right after I witnessed the cheating, like she'd been waiting for it to happen. My hands were shaking. So bad I almost dropped my phone as I took a screenshot of the photo. I zoomed in on Lori and my ex and took another screenshot of just that section. This was proof. Proof that Lori had lied about when she arrived. Proof that she'd been talking to my ex before everything fell apart. I felt anger rising in my chest, hot and sharp. My best friend had set me up. She'd pushed me to go to the party, talked to my ex beforehand, and then appeared right when I needed her most like some kind of hero. And now she was pretending to be the girl I'd connected with, taking away the one good thing from that horrible night. That evening, I was reorganizing the mystery section when the bell above the door chimed. I looked up and saw Elliot walking in alone. My heart jumped into my throat as he headed straight toward me. He looked uncomfortable, like he wasn't sure he should be there. He stopped a few feet away and said Lori's story about Halloween night didn't match up with the conversation he remembered. He needed to know the truth about what really happened. I gripped the book in my hands so tight my knuckles turned white. Part of me wanted to tell him everything right then, show him the screenshots, explain how Lori had manipulated both of us. But another part of me was terrified. What if he thought I was just jealous? What if he thought I was making things up to break them apart? Lori was his girlfriend now. He might believe her over me. I set the book down carefully and looked at him. Instead of launching into accusations about Lori, I decided to test him. I asked if he remembered what we talked about that night at the dart booth. He said we talked about cheating and relationships. I nodded and asked what specific thing I'd told him about my situation. He said I'd told him about my boyfriend cheating on me at the party. I pushed further, asking what he'd said to make me feel better. Elliot's face got more confused as he tried to remember exact details. I asked him what he'd told me about his own family, about why he understood what I was going through. I could see him searching his memory, trying to recall the conversation. I mentioned how he'd talked about someone in his family dealing with cheating and asked if he remembered who. His face started to change as he realized where I was going with this. Elliot's expression shifted completely when I brought up his mother's cheating. I told him the exact words he'd said that night about his dad blaming himself even though it wasn't his fault. I repeated back what he'd told me about people who cheat looking for something easier, not something better. His eyes got wide and he took a step back like I'd shocked him. He stared at me for a long moment before saying there was no way Lori could know those details. He'd never told anyone else about his mom, not even his close friends. It was too personal, too painful. The only person he'd ever told was the girl at the Halloween party. The girl he'd been searching for. Me. I watched the realization spread across his face as he understood that I was telling the truth. But I could also see the confusion and hurt as he processed what this meant about Lori. Why would she lie about something so specific? What did she have to gain from pretending to be someone she wasn't? The door chimes rang and I looked up to see Lori walking in. Her face went from surprise to something else entirely when she spotted me and Elliot standing close together near the counter. She walked straight over and positioned herself between us, her hand reaching out to touch Elliot's arm. Her smile looked sweet, but her eyes were hard as she glanced at me. I took a step back, my heart starting to pound because I knew what was coming. Lori's eyes started filling with tears and her voice cracked when she spoke. She told Elliot I was trying to steal him because I was jealous of their relationship. She said I'd always been obsessed with him since middle school, making up stories about connecting with him. I felt my mouth drop open because none of that was true. I'd barely thought about Elliot after he transferred schools until Halloween night, but Lori kept going, her performance getting more dramatic with every word. She grabbed onto Elliot's sleeve and said I couldn't stand seeing her happy for once. Elliot looked between us, his face showing confusion and uncertainty. I could see him trying to figure out who was telling the truth. Lori started crying harder, saying she knew I'd try something like this eventually. My chance to explain was disappearing fast as Lori's tears got bigger and her voice got louder. I felt panic rising in my chest because everything was spinning out of control. Then something clicked in my brain and I remembered the books. I interrupted Lori mid-sob and told Elliot to ask her something. I said to ask her what his mother's favorite book genre was, since Lori claimed to have helped him pick out a gift earlier. Lori stopped crying for a second, her face going blank. She looked at me and then at Elliot before saying romance novels, her voice less shaky now. I shook my head and said historical fiction, specifically books about World War II and the Tudor period. Elliot's expression changed completely. He stepped back from Lori and asked her directly why she would lie about being at the bookstore with him. Lori's tears stopped like someone had flipped a switch. Her face went red and she looked at me with pure anger before turning and walking out without saying another word. The door slammed behind her hard enough to make the windows rattle. Elliot and I stood there in awkward silence for what felt like forever. The bookstore suddenly felt too quiet after all that noise. He looked at me and asked quietly if I was really the girl from Halloween. I nodded and walked over to the drawer under the register where I kept my stuff. I pulled out the mask I'd worn that night, the one Lori had been holding earlier when she walked in claiming to be me. Elliot took the mask from my hands and turned it over, studying it like he was making sure it was real. He sat down heavily on the steps leading up to the store's second floor. I sat beside him, leaving some space between us. Both of us were trying to make sense of what Lori had done and why. He'd been dating someone who lied to him while the real girl he'd been searching for was working at this bookstore the whole time. I pulled out my phone and found the screenshot I'd taken earlier. I showed him the picture from my ex's social media where Lori was talking to my ex at the party. Elliot took my phone and looked at the image carefully, zooming in on Lori's face. He mentioned that Lori had asked him really specific questions about what the Halloween girl looked like and what we talked about. She'd wanted to know everything, down to what color my mask was and whether I had any special jewelry on. I felt sick realizing she'd used all that information to create her fake story. We sat there putting the pieces together and realized Lori had crafted everything based on details she'd gotten from Elliot, but she couldn't have known the deeper personal stuff we'd shared that night. Elliot admitted he'd felt something was off about her story, but he wanted to believe he'd found the right girl so badly that he ignored the weird feelings. He said some of the things she claimed we talked about didn't match his memory, but he convinced himself he'd just forgotten. The next few days were weird and tense. I couldn't stop thinking about Lori and what she'd done. I kept going over every conversation we'd had, looking for signs I'd missed. I decided I needed to know more about my ex's cheating and whether Lori had been involved in setting that up too. I found Scott Melton's number in my phone. He was one of my ex's close friends and had been at the Halloween party. I texted him asking if we could talk about something important. He responded pretty quickly saying sure and asking what was up. I asked him if anyone had encouraged my ex to bring a date to the party that night. The 3 dots showing he was typing appeared and disappeared a few times before his response finally came through. Scott's text popped up on my screen and my stomach twisted into knots. He admitted that Lori had stopped by his place earlier that week before the party. She'd mentioned something about how I'd been acting distant with my boyfriend and maybe looking at other guys around town. Scott said Lori suggested that my ex should make me jealous to see if I really cared. I read the message 3 times, each word making me feel sicker. The manipulation went so much deeper than I'd imagined. Lori hadn't just taken advantage of my heartbreak at the party. She'd actually set up the whole cheating situation from the start. I texted Scott back asking if he was sure about the timing, and he confirmed it was definitely before Halloween. I sat there staring at my phone, trying to wrap my head around the fact that my best friend had spent time planning how to destroy my relationship. The next morning, I messaged my ex asking if we could meet up to talk. He agreed pretty quickly and suggested the coffee shop on Main Street. I got there first and grabbed a table in the back corner where we could have some privacy. When he walked in, he looked nervous and kept his hands shoved in his jacket pockets. He sat down across from me and immediately started defending himself, saying he had his reasons for what happened at the party. I cut him off and asked directly if Lori had talked to him before Halloween. His face changed and he looked down at the table. He admitted that Lori had pulled him aside about a week before the party and told him I was planning to break up with him. She'd said I was just waiting for the right time and that I'd been talking about other guys. He thought he was protecting himself from getting hurt by moving on first. I felt my hands shake as I gripped my coffee cup. My ex kept talking, explaining how Lori had actually introduced him to the girl at the party. She'd positioned them near the entrance where she knew I'd walk in and see them right away. He genuinely thought he was beating me to the punch, not realizing he was used as a tool in Lori's twisted plan. I asked him why he didn't just talk to me about it, and he got quiet for a long moment. He said he was scared and stupid, and that Lori had seemed so concerned and genuine. The anger I felt toward him mixed with this weird sense of pity. We'd both been played by someone we trusted. He apologized then. Really apologized. Not the half-hearted sorry from before. He admitted he should have communicated with me instead of believing Lori's lies. I told him I accepted his apology, but that we were done for good. He nodded like he expected that and said he understood. We sat there for another minute in uncomfortable silence before he left. I stayed at the coffee shop for another hour, pulling out my phone and opening a notes app. I started writing down everything I knew about Lori's manipulation, creating a timeline of events. She'd talked to my ex a week before Halloween, planted seeds of doubt and jealousy. She'd set up the introduction with the other girl at the party. She'd convinced me to go to the party even though my boyfriend was supposedly sick. She'd been there to witness my heartbreak and position herself as my only support. Then she'd swooped in to claim she was the Halloween girl, using details she'd gotten from Elliot to make her story believable. The whole thing had taken weeks of careful planning. She'd spent all that time and energy making sure I'd end up heartbroken and vulnerable at that party. When I got back to the bookstore, Freya took one look at my face and pulled me into the back room. I showed her my timeline and explained everything I'd learned from Scott and my ex. Freya read through my notes carefully, and then looked up at me with this serious expression. She suggested that maybe Lori wanted me isolated and hurting, so she could control how I reacted to everything. I thought about that for a second, and realized Lori had always been the first person I called when something went wrong. She'd positioned herself as my main support system, the one person I could count on. That night at home, I couldn't stop thinking about what Freya had said. I opened my text messages and started scrolling back through months of conversations with Lori. A pattern emerged that made my chest feel tight. Every time I'd mentioned getting closer to someone new, Lori had found a reason why that person wasn't trustworthy. When I'd talked about joining a study group, she'd said those people were fake and just wanted to use me for answers. When I'd mentioned a girl from work seemed cool, Lori had brought up some rumor about her being two-faced. She'd always had a reason why someone didn't really care about me or couldn't be trusted. I'd thought she was just being protective, looking out for me. But now I could see she'd been systematically cutting me off from other friendships, making sure I stayed dependent on her. My phone buzzed with a text from Elliot asking if I could meet him at the park near the bookstore. He said he needed to talk to me privately, and that he was bringing his friend Cody who'd been at the Halloween party. I agreed and headed over, my heart beating faster with each step. When I got to the park, Elliot was standing by the fountain with another guy I recognized from around town. Elliot introduced him as Cody and explained that he'd asked him to come verify some things about Halloween night. Cody smiled at me and said he definitely remembered seeing me and Elliot together at the dart booth. He described my costume in detail, even mentioning the specific color of my mask. Then he brought up how Elliot had talked to him later that night about meeting a girl whose mom had cheated on her dad. Cody said Elliot had been really affected by the conversation and kept saying he needed to find this girl again. This independent verification of everything that happened made my whole body relax. Someone else had witnessed it. Someone who had no reason to lie. Elliot looked relieved too, like he'd been carrying around doubt despite believing me. Then his expression got more serious and he told me he'd broken up with Lori that morning. My stomach dropped. He explained that when he'd confronted her about lying, she'd completely refused to accept the breakup. She'd actually threatened to spread rumors about both of us around town if he tried to pursue me. Elliot said her whole sweet personality had just vanished in an instant, replaced by someone cold and mean. The mask she'd been wearing had finally fallen away completely, and now we were seeing who Lori really was underneath all the fake friendship and manipulation. The next morning, I woke up to 3 missed calls from people I barely talked to anymore. My phone kept buzzing with texts asking if I was okay, and mentioning something about Elliot. I scrolled through the messages and my stomach dropped when I saw what Lori had been posting on social media. She'd written this long post about how I was trying to ruin her relationship because I was jealous and couldn't handle seeing her happy. She made it sound like I'd always been obsessed with Elliot and was making up lies to break them up. The post had dozens of comments from people I knew, and some of them were actually agreeing with her. People who'd known Lori longer than they'd known me were taking her side without even asking for my version of what happened. I sat there staring at my phone, watching the comments pile up, feeling like the whole town was turning against me based on her lies. My hands were shaking as I screenshot everything she'd posted before she could delete it later. I needed proof of what she was saying about me. Over the next 2 days, I kept running into people who'd clearly heard Lori's version of events. At the grocery store, one of her friends literally turned around and walked the other way when she saw me. The woman who ran the coffee shop gave me this pitying look like I was some desperate girl chasing after someone else's boyfriend. I wanted to scream at all of them that they had no idea what really happened, but I knew that would just make me look worse. Instead, I started gathering every piece of evidence I had. I organized all the screenshots into a folder on my phone. The photo of Lori talking to my ex before I even arrived at the Halloween party. The text messages where she'd discouraged me from making other friends. The timeline I'd written out showing how she'd manipulated everything. I also had the statements from Scott about how Lori had encouraged my ex to cheat, and my ex's own admission that she'd lied to him about me planning to break up with him. I texted Miranda and asked if she could meet me at the coffee shop on Main Street. She agreed immediately and brought 2 other friends with her who'd been asking questions about the whole situation. When I sat down with them, I didn't say anything at first. I just handed Miranda my phone and let her scroll through everything. She passed it to the others, and I watched their faces change as they read through the evidence. Miranda looked up at me with wide eyes and said she had no idea Lori had been at the party that early. One of the other friends pointed at the screenshot showing Lori with my ex and said that completely changed everything. I showed them Scott's messages confirming that Lori had set up the whole cheating situation. Then I showed them my ex's texts admitting Lori had lied to him about me. The timeline made it clear that Lori had spent weeks planning this whole thing just to hurt me. By the time they finished looking at everything, all 3 of them believed me. Miranda actually apologized for not questioning Lori's story sooner. She said she'd felt weird about how quickly Lori had claimed to be the Halloween girl, but hadn't wanted to get involved in drama. Now she realized staying silent had let Lori keep lying. The next afternoon, I was working alone at the bookstore during the slow period after lunch. Freya had gone to the bank to make a deposit, and I was restocking shelves in the back when I heard the front door chime. I walked out to the counter and froze when I saw Lori standing there. She wasn't crying or looking sad like she had been in public. Her face was cold and angry, and she crossed her arms as soon as she saw me. She walked right up to the counter and told me I was ruining everything by showing people those screenshots. Her voice was different now, harder and meaner than I'd ever heard it. She said I always had to make everything about me and couldn't just let her be happy for once. I stared at her, trying to process this version of Lori I'd never seen before. She kept going, saying I'd always had things too easy. My family owned a business. People liked me without me having to try to. I'd never had to work for friendships the way she did. She said I deserved to feel the pain she'd been feeling for years watching me coast through life while she struggled. My heart was pounding, but I managed to keep my voice steady when I asked what she meant. That's when everything came spilling out. She admitted she'd set up my ex to cheat on me at the party. She'd spent weeks convincing him I was going to dump him, and that he should protect himself by moving on first. She'd even picked out the girl for him to kiss, and made sure they'd be standing exactly where I'd see them. I slowly reached into my pocket and turned on my phone's voice recorder, keeping it hidden while Lori kept talking. She said she'd been jealous of me since the day we became friends. Every time something good happened to me, it felt like proof that her life wasn't as good. She resented my relationship with my ex even though she'd smiled and said she was happy for me. She hated that my family's bookstore was successful while her parents struggled with money. She couldn't stand the way people naturally liked me and wanted to be around me when she had to work so hard for every friendship. Her voice got louder as she listed everything she'd envied about my life. She said watching me be happy made her feel worse about herself, like my good things somehow took away from her chances at having good things too. I kept the phone recording in my pocket while she revealed more and more. She admitted she'd seen the photos of me and Elliot at the Halloween party online before she ever talked to me about them. She'd recognized my costume and mask immediately. When she saw Elliot searching for the Halloween girl, she realized she could take that moment away from me and make herself the center of his attention instead. Lori said she'd specifically targeted Elliot's search because she knew I'd connected with him that night. She'd watched me come back to find her after midnight looking happier than I'd been in months. She'd seen the way I smiled when I talked about the guy at the dart booth. So when Elliot started posting those pictures looking for me, she saw the perfect chance to hurt me even more. She wanted to make me watch her have what I wanted. She wanted me to see her with Elliot and know that the one good thing from that horrible night was being taken away. She said it felt fair after years of watching me have everything while she had nothing. She wanted me to finally understand what it felt like to want something desperately and not be able to have it. Her hands were shaking as she talked, and I could see tears starting to form in her eyes, even though her voice stayed angry. I asked her why she would go this far just because she was jealous. That's when she broke down completely. She sank into one of the reading chairs near the counter and put her head in her hands. Through sobs, she said she'd always felt like she was in my shadow. Every friendship felt like a competition she was losing. Every achievement I had felt like it diminished her own accomplishments. Every relationship I was in reminded her of her own loneliness. She said she'd tried so hard to be happy for me over the years, but the jealousy kept growing until she couldn't ignore it anymore. She'd started hating herself for feeling that way, which made her resent me even more for being the cause of those feelings. She knew it wasn't logical or fair, but she couldn't stop comparing her life to mine and always finding hers lacking. She said the Halloween party felt like her breaking point. Seeing my ex cheat should have made her feel bad for me, but instead she'd felt this sick satisfaction that finally something bad was happening to me too. Then when she saw I'd connected with Elliot despite everything, she'd felt that jealousy turn into real anger. She couldn't stand that even on my worst night, I'd managed to find something good. I stood there listening to her confession, feeling this complicated mix of emotions I couldn't sort out. Part of me was furious at what she'd done and how deliberately she'd tried to hurt me, but another part of me felt genuinely sad for the pain she'd been carrying around. I understood feeling jealous sometimes or comparing yourself to friends, but I also knew that her jealousy didn't excuse the cruel things she'd done. She'd made active choices to manipulate people and cause harm. She'd spent weeks planning how to hurt me instead of just talking to me about how she felt. I took a breath and told her our friendship was over. I said I understood she'd been struggling with these feelings, but that didn't make it okay to orchestrate my ex's cheating or lie about being the Halloween girl. I told her she needed to leave the bookstore and stay away from me. She looked up at me with red eyes and started to say something, but I cut her off. I said I hoped she'd get help for the jealousy and pain she was feeling, but I couldn't be her friend anymore after everything she'd done. That's when she noticed my hand in my pocket. Her eyes went wide and she jumped up from the chair. She asked if I'd been recording her and reached for my phone. I pulled it out and stepped back, holding it away from her. She lunged across the counter trying to grab it, saying I couldn't use that recording because she hadn't known I was recording. I kept backing up toward the storage room, keeping the phone out of her reach. She was yelling now, demanding I delete it. Just then, Freya walked in through the back entrance carrying the bank deposit bag. She stopped in the doorway and took in the scene with Lori halfway across the counter reaching for me. Freya asked what was going on, and I told her Lori had just confessed to everything. Freya's eyes went hard, and she told Lori she needed to leave immediately. Lori looked between us, realizing she'd been caught completely. She started crying again, but these felt like real tears of panic rather than manipulation. She backed toward the door, saying this wasn't fair and I'd tricked her. Freya walked her to the exit and firmly closed the door behind her, locking it even though we were still open. I stood there shaking, still holding my phone with the recording. Freya came over and hugged me, saying she'd heard most of the conversation from the back room before she came in. She'd been standing there listening to make sure I was safe. I played the recording back from the beginning to make sure it had captured everything clearly. Lori's voice came through perfectly, admitting to setting up the cheating, lying about being the Halloween girl and targeting Elliot specifically to hurt me. Freya said this was exactly the proof I needed, and I should share it with Elliot right away. I texted him asking if he could come to the bookstore when we closed in an hour. He responded immediately saying he'd be there. The rest of the afternoon dragged by slowly. I kept replaying Lori's words in my head, still processing everything she'd admitted. When closing time came, Freya offered to stay with me, but I told her I needed to do this alone. She hugged me again and left through the back. 5 minutes later, Elliot knocked on the front door. I let him in and locked it behind him. We sat at one of the reading tables and I handed him my phone with the recording queued up. I watched his face as he listened to the whole thing. His expression shifted from confused to shocked to angry as Lori's confession played out. When it finished, he sat back in his chair and just stared at the table for a long moment. He said he couldn't believe the depth of her manipulation and how much pain she'd been carrying around. He admitted he felt stupid for not seeing through her lies sooner. He said there had been small moments where her story didn't quite add up, but he'd wanted so badly to find the Halloween girl that he'd ignored the inconsistencies. He apologized for not trusting his gut and for putting me through weeks of watching them together. I told him it wasn't his fault because Lori had been incredibly careful with her lies. She'd used information he'd told her about that night to make her story believable. We sat there talking about what to do next. I said I wanted people to know the truth, but I didn't want to turn this into huge town drama or public revenge. Elliot agreed completely. He said Lori clearly needed help for her jealousy and mental health issues, and blasting her publicly wouldn't actually help anyone. We decided we'd share the truth with our close friends, and the people who'd been asking questions. We'd let them hear the recording if they wanted proof. But we wouldn't post it online or make a big public statement. We'd just quietly correct the lies Lori had spread and let the truth spread naturally through people who actually cared about what really happened. Elliot reached across the table and took my hand. He said he was sorry for everything I'd been through and thanked me for handling it with more grace than Lori deserved. I squeezed his hand back, feeling like finally we could move forward without lies between us. Over the next week, I shared the recording with our close friends one by one. Miranda came to the bookstore first and listened to the whole thing with her hand over her mouth. She apologized 3 times for believing Lori's version of events and hugged me before she left. 2 other friends from our group texted asking to hear it, and I met them at a coffee shop where they listened on my phone with headphones. Both of them looked shocked by how calculated Lori's confession sounded, how she admitted to everything without any real remorse in her voice. They said they felt stupid for not questioning her story more carefully, and promised to set the record straight with anyone who'd heard the rumors. By the end of the week, most of our friend group knew the truth, and the few people who still believed Lori's lies weren't really friends worth keeping anyway. The hardest part was watching how quickly the story spread through town, not as gossip, but as genuine shock that someone could manipulate people so thoroughly. On Tuesday afternoon, a couple I didn't recognize walked into the bookstore during a slow period. The woman had Lori's eyes, and I knew immediately who they were before they even introduced themselves. Her parents looked tired and sad as they approached the counter and asked if they could talk to me privately. We sat at one of the reading tables in the back corner, and her mom started crying before she even spoke. They apologized for what Lori had done, saying they had no idea she'd been struggling so badly with jealousy and depression. Her dad explained that Lori had always compared herself to other people, especially me, but they thought it was normal teenage insecurity that she'd outgrow. They never imagined she'd act on those feelings in such a harmful way, never saw signs that she was capable of the manipulation I'd experienced. Her mom kept saying she felt like she'd failed as a parent, that she should have noticed something was wrong and gotten Lori help sooner. I listened to them talk and felt a weird mix of anger at Lori and sympathy for her parents who clearly loved her and were blindsided by this. When they finished, I told them I appreciated them coming here and apologizing, but I needed space from Lori for the foreseeable future. I explained that what she did wasn't just a mistake or a moment of poor judgment. It was months of calculated manipulation that hurt multiple people, and I couldn't just forgive that because she was struggling mentally. Her parents nodded and said they completely understood, that they weren't asking me to forgive her or be her friend again. Her mom mentioned that Lori was starting therapy twice a week to work through her jealousy issues and self-esteem problems, that they were taking this seriously and getting her real help. I thanked them for telling me and walked them to the door, feeling emotionally exhausted from the conversation, but glad they'd at least acknowledged what happened. After that day, Elliot and I started spending more time together, but we were both careful about it. We'd grab coffee between his classes and my shifts at the bookstore, sitting in corner booths where we could talk without the whole town watching. We went on walks through the park where we'd just talk about random things like books and movies and stupid stuff from our childhoods. Neither of us rushed into anything physical or tried to recreate that Halloween night kiss right away. We were both too aware of how badly we'd been manipulated, how Lori had used our connection as a weapon against us, and we needed to rebuild that trust slowly. Sometimes we'd sit in comfortable silence, and that felt more intimate than any grand romantic gesture could have been. We were learning each other again, but this time with our masks off and our real selves showing. One evening, while we were sitting on a bench near the duck pond, Elliot started telling me about the weeks he spent searching for the Halloween girl. He described putting up posters all over town, asking every person he ran into if they knew who she might be, checking his phone, constantly hoping someone would reach out. He said he felt crazy doing it, like some character in a movie, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd met someone important that night. Hearing him talk about searching for me while Lori was pretending to be me made my chest hurt all over again. The betrayal felt fresh and raw, knowing that while he was desperately trying to find me, my best friend was actively working to make sure we'd never connect. I had to look away from him for a minute because tears were forming, and I didn't want to cry about Lori anymore. I told Elliot how Lori's manipulation made me question everything about myself and my ability to trust people. I explained that I kept replaying moments from our friendship, wondering what was real and what was just her playing a role to stay close to me. Every time someone was nice now, I caught myself wondering what they really wanted, or if they secretly resented me like Lori had. Elliot reached over and took my hand, saying he felt exactly the same way. He admitted he'd been going through his other relationships in his head, wondering which friends were genuine and which ones might be using him because his dad was the mayor. We sat there holding hands and talking about how weird it was that Lori's lies had made us both paranoid about everyone else's honesty. That conversation led to us making a decision that became really important for our relationship. We agreed to be completely honest with each other about everything, even uncomfortable or embarrassing things. If something bothered us, we'd say it instead of letting it build up. If we were scared or insecure, we'd admit it instead of pretending to be fine. We made honesty our foundation because we'd both seen what happens when people hide their real feelings and let resentment grow in the dark. It sounds simple, but it was actually kind of scary to commit to that level of openness with someone. Still, after everything with Lori, we knew that lies and manipulation had almost kept us apart, and we weren't going to let that happen again. A few days later, my ex-boyfriend texted me asking if we could talk. I almost ignored it, but something made me agree to meet him at the same coffee shop where this whole mess had started to unravel. He looked different, less confident maybe, and he got straight to the point. He apologized again for cheating and for believing Lori's lies about me, and then he told me he was cutting ties with her completely. He explained that he'd been working with a therapist on his trust issues, realizing that he'd let Lori poison his view of our relationship because he was insecure. He said he should have talked to me directly, instead of listening to someone else's version of what I was thinking or feeling. The apology felt genuine, and I could see he was actually trying to grow from this. I accepted his apology and told him I appreciated him being honest about everything, but I also made it very clear that we weren't getting back together. That relationship had ended for good reasons that went beyond just the cheating, and I'd moved forward with my life. He nodded like he'd expected that answer and said he understood, that he just wanted to clear the air and take responsibility for his part in the drama. We finished our coffee and parted on decent terms. Not friends, but not enemies either. It felt good to close that chapter properly, instead of leaving it messy and unresolved. Through all of this, Freya became a much closer friend than she'd been before. We started taking our lunch breaks together, and she'd stay after closing sometimes to help me organize shelves while we talked. One day she mentioned how Lori used to make little comments about her. Nothing major, but enough to make me feel slightly uncomfortable around Freya. I realized Lori had been doing that with several people, subtly creating distance between me and anyone who might become a close friend. She'd position herself as my only real friend, the only person who truly understood me, while quietly undermining every other friendship I tried to build. Now I made a real effort to strengthen the friendships Lori had tried to damage, reaching out to people I'd drifted away from and rebuilding those connections. It was like cleaning out a wound, painful but necessary, and I could feel myself getting healthier as I let go of Lori's influence and surrounded myself with people who genuinely cared about me. A week later, Elliot asked if I wanted to meet his mother properly, not just as the bookstore clerk, but as the girl he'd been searching for. My stomach twisted with nerves as we walked into the mayor's house, a big old place on the hill with white columns and perfectly trimmed hedges. His mother answered the door and her face lit up the second she saw me. She pulled me into a hug before I could even say hello, telling me she remembered me from the bookstore and how I'd always helped her find the perfect books. She led us into the kitchen where she'd made cookies, and we sat around the table while she asked me about my family and the bookstore and college plans. Then she got this knowing look and said Elliot had seemed different after Halloween, happier somehow, but he wouldn't tell her why. She'd suspected he'd met someone special that night, and now seeing us together made perfect sense. I felt my cheeks get hot, but Elliot just smiled and squeezed my hand under the table. His mother poured us tea and the conversation shifted to something more serious. She started talking about how marriage takes real work, especially after trust gets broken. She explained that last year she'd made a terrible mistake and had an affair with someone from her book club. Elliot's father found out and their whole world fell apart for a while. She said the months after were the hardest of her life, watching her husband blame himself and question everything about their relationship. But they decided to try therapy instead of giving up, going to sessions twice a week where they had to be completely honest about their feelings and fears. The therapist made them do exercises where they practiced talking about hard things without getting defensive or shutting down. Slowly, over many months, they started rebuilding what they'd broken. She looked at both of us and said the key was choosing honesty every single day, even when it felt scary or uncomfortable. Hearing her story made something shift in my chest. If they could work through something that painful and come out stronger, maybe real healing was actually possible after betrayal. Maybe Lori's manipulation didn't have to define how I approached relationships forever. His mother reached across the table and patted my hand, telling me she could see I was good for her son, that I had a kind heart and a strong spirit. When we left, Elliot walked me home and we talked about his parents, and how much courage it took for them to stay together and do the work. He said watching them go through that had taught him the value of honesty, which was probably why our conversation on Halloween night had felt so important to him. 2 months after the Halloween party, Elliot and I finally went on our first real date. We'd been spending time together at the bookstore and taking walks around town, but this felt different, more official somehow. We chose a restaurant in the next town over, about 30 minutes away, where we could just be ourselves without everyone watching and gossiping about the mayor's son and the bookstore girl. The drive there was easy, with music playing and both of us singing along badly to songs on the radio. We talked about everything and nothing, the way you do when you're comfortable with someone but still excited to learn more. The restaurant was this small Italian place with checkered tablecloths and candles on every table. We ordered pasta and shared garlic bread, and the whole night felt natural and easy, like continuing the conversation we'd started under the moonlight at the party. We laughed about how complicated the path had been to get here, with Lori's lies and the bookstore confrontation and all the drama in between. Elliot said he'd never forget the look on Lori's face when she realized her story was falling apart, and I admitted I'd replayed that moment in my head more times than I wanted to count. But we both agreed it was worth it. All the confusion and hurt and uncertainty, because we'd ended up here together. He told me about his plans after college, wanting to work in community development instead of following his father into politics. I shared my dream of maybe opening my own bookstore someday, something smaller and cozier than my family's place. We stayed until the restaurant was closing, not wanting the night to end. On the drive home, he held my hand across the center console, and I felt this quiet happiness settle over me, the kind that doesn't need words or big gestures. The next weekend, there was a community event at the town square, one of those outdoor markets with craft booths and food trucks. I went with Freya, browsing handmade jewelry and trying samples from the bakery stand. That's when I saw Lori across the crowd, standing near the fountain with her arms wrapped around herself. She looked smaller somehow, less sure of herself than she used to be. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she was wearing an old hoodie I recognized from high school. Our eyes met for just a second before she quickly looked away, pretending to be very interested in her phone. I felt this weird mix of relief that she wasn't trying to approach me and sadness for the friendship we'd lost, even though I knew that friendship had been built on shaky ground. Freya noticed me staring and asked if I was okay. I nodded and turned away, focusing on a booth selling homemade candles instead. The rest of the day, I kept catching glimpses of Lori in the crowd, always at a distance, always moving away when she saw me looking. It was strange seeing her like that, almost like she was a ghost of the person I used to know. Part of me wanted to feel angry or triumphant, but mostly I just felt tired of the whole situation. I was ready to move forward without her shadow hanging over everything. Later that week, Freya and I were organizing the new releases section at the bookstore when she mentioned she'd heard some news about Lori. Apparently, Lori had moved to stay with relatives in another state, needing a fresh start away from everything that had happened here. Freya said Lori's mom had come into the bookstore earlier that week and explained that Lori was going to therapy and working on herself, trying to figure out why she'd acted the way she did. I stood there holding a stack of books, processing this information. Part of me felt relieved that I wouldn't have to keep running into her around town, wouldn't have to deal with that awkward tension every time we crossed paths. But another part of me, a small part, hoped she actually would find the help she needed and learn to be happy for other people instead of tearing them down. I didn't want to be her friend again. That door was closed, but I didn't want her to be miserable forever either. Freya asked if I was going to reach out to her, and I shook my head. Some bridges are better left burned, and this was one of them. We finished shelving the books and moved on to other topics, but the news stayed with me for the rest of the day. That night, Elliot came over to my apartment and we started what would become our tradition of honesty nights. We sat on my couch with mugs of hot chocolate and took turns sharing things we were scared to say out loud. I told him about my fear that he'd eventually realize I wasn't worth all the drama, that he'd regret choosing me over an easier relationship. He shared his worry that he'd mess things up like he had in middle school, that he'd hurt me without meaning to and lose me forever. We talked about our insecurities and difficult feelings, the stuff most people keep hidden because it feels too raw or embarrassing. But we'd decided after everything with Lori that we weren't going to let things fester in silence. We were going to put our cards on the table, even when it was uncomfortable, because manipulation and hidden feelings had almost kept us apart. This became our way of making sure we stayed connected and honest with each other. Every week or two, we'd set aside time to check in, to talk about what was really going on beneath the surface. Sometimes the conversations were heavy, and sometimes they were lighter, but they always left me feeling closer to him. It was different from any relationship I'd had before. This commitment to being completely real with each other instead of pretending everything was always fine. My parents started noticing changes in me around this time. My mom commented one morning over breakfast that I seemed happier, more confident in myself. She said I wasn't second-guessing every decision or worrying so much about what other people thought. My dad agreed, mentioning that I'd been smiling more and seemed more relaxed than I had in months. Then my mom dropped a bomb, admitting they'd never quite trusted Lori, but didn't want to interfere in my friendships. She said something about Lori had always felt off to her, the way she'd monopolize my time and subtly put down my other friends. My dad nodded, adding that Lori seemed to need to be the center of attention in every situation, even when it was supposed to be about someone else. I sat there stunned, wondering how I'd missed what my parents had seen so clearly. But I guess when you're in the middle of something, it's harder to see the patterns. They told me they were proud of how I'd handled everything, standing up for myself and choosing honesty over revenge. My mom hugged me and said she was glad I'd found someone like Elliot who treated me with respect and kindness. The conversation made me realize how much their support had meant through everything, even when I didn't fully recognize it at the time. Sitting in my room that night, I thought about everything that had happened since Halloween. Lori's betrayal had cut deep. There was no denying that. Finding out your best friend had been manipulating you and tearing down your relationships felt like the ground dropping out from under your feet. But in a strange way, it had also taught me something valuable about trusting my own instincts. I'd ignored little warning signs about Lori for years. The subtle comments that made me feel bad about myself, the way she'd discourage me from getting close to other people, how she always needed to be involved in every aspect of my life. I'd brushed those feelings aside because I didn't want to be paranoid or judgmental. Now I understood that sometimes your gut knows things your brain hasn't caught up to yet. I was building healthier relationships now, with Freya and other friends who celebrated my successes instead of competing with me. I was learning to recognize when someone's friendship felt conditional, or based on comparison rather than genuine care. The experience had been painful, but it had also made me stronger and more aware. I wasn't going to let someone treat me that way again, because now I knew what real friendship looked like, and what it definitely didn't look like. The following weekend, Elliot and I were walking through the park when he stopped and turned to face me. He said he'd been thinking about how I'd handled everything with Lori, and wanted me to know how much he respected the way I'd approached the situation. He explained that watching me choose honesty and truth over revenge or retaliation had shown him the kind of person I truly was. He said a lot of people would have wanted to hurt Lori back, to publicly shame her or make her life difficult, but I'd taken the high road. I'd gathered the evidence and shared the truth with people who needed to know, but I hadn't tried to destroy her or make her suffer. Even when she'd threatened to spread rumors about us, I'd stayed focused on moving forward instead of getting dragged into a war. Elliot said that level of grace under pressure was rare, and it made him even more sure about us. I felt my throat get tight with emotion because his words meant more than he probably realized. After months of feeling stupid and foolish for not seeing Lori's manipulation sooner, hearing that someone saw strength in how I'd handled it helped heal something inside me. We kept walking, his arm around my shoulders, and I felt grateful for the strange path that had led us here. The Halloween party that started with heartbreak had somehow ended with something real and honest, and that felt like the best possible outcome. The Winter Festival came 3 weeks later, and Elliot asked if I wanted to go with him. I said yes without hesitation. We walked through the town square holding hands while white lights hung from every lamppost and the smell of hot chocolate filled the cold air. People were everywhere, bundled in coats and scarves, their breath making little clouds in the freezing night. I spotted a few familiar faces from the crowd who had believed Lori's rumors when she first started spreading them. One woman from my mom's book club stopped us near the ice skating rink. She touched my arm gently and told me she was sorry for judging the situation without knowing the full story. She said she should have talked to me directly, instead of listening to gossip. Another guy from Elliot's high school friend group came up and shook Elliot's hand, admitting he'd been wrong to question our relationship. He said seeing us together made it clear that whatever Lori had claimed was obviously not true. Each apology felt like a small weight lifting off my shoulders. Elliot squeezed my hand after each interaction, and I could feel his support without him having to say anything. We grabbed hot cider from a booth and found Cody standing near the carousel with a huge grin on his face. He walked over and immediately started laughing before he even said anything. He looked at Elliot and said the whole search could have been avoided if Elliot had just paid attention to basic details. Cody explained that I'd been wearing the same perfume at the bookstore that I wore on Halloween night, something Elliot should have noticed right away if he'd been thinking clearly. Elliot's face turned red and he tried to defend himself, but Cody kept going, listing all the obvious signs that were right in front of him. The mask sitting on the bookstore counter, the way I finished his sentence about the most honest thing he'd felt, even the fact that I knew specific details about his mom's reading preferences. We all started laughing because looking back, it really was so obvious. I admitted I should have just told him the truth right away, instead of letting Lori walk in and complicate everything. Cody said we were both idiots, but at least we figured it out eventually. The whole conversation felt light and easy, like we could finally joke about the situation without the weight of Lori's manipulation hanging over us. 4 months had passed since Halloween and Elliot and I had built something solid. We weren't perfect, and we still had moments where old insecurities crept in. Sometimes I'd worry that he'd realize I wasn't as interesting as that first conversation made me seem. Other times he'd get quiet and withdrawn, convinced he was going to mess things up like he had with past relationships. But we talked through every fear and doubt instead of letting them build up in silence. We made a rule that if something bothered either of us, we had to say it out loud within 24 hours. No festering, no assumptions, no letting small problems become big ones. That honesty we shared at the Halloween party became the foundation for everything else. It wasn't always comfortable having those conversations, but they kept us connected in a way that felt real and lasting. I checked my email one morning at the bookstore and saw an acceptance letter from a college program I'd applied to months ago. My hands shook as I read it because I'd almost not applied at all. Looking back, I realized Lori had subtly discouraged me from going for it. She'd made comments about how competitive the program was and how disappointed I'd be if I didn't get in. She'd suggested I focus on the bookstore instead of chasing something that might not work out. At the time, I thought she was being protective, trying to save me from potential failure. Now I understood she'd been holding me back, keeping me small so she could feel bigger by comparison. Elliot came into the bookstore that afternoon and I showed him the acceptance letter. His face lit up immediately and he picked me up in a hug, spinning me around between the bookshelves. He started asking questions about the program, what classes I'd take, how excited I was to start. There wasn't a single hint of jealousy or worry about what my success might mean for us. He was genuinely thrilled for me, celebrating my achievement without making it about himself. That reaction meant more than he probably realized because it showed me what real support looked like. A week later, I ran into my ex at the grocery store. He was with a new girl, someone I vaguely recognized from around town. They were laughing together in the produce section and he looked genuinely happy. When he spotted me, there was a brief moment of awkwardness, but then he smiled and walked over. He introduced his girlfriend and asked how I was doing. I told him about the college program and he congratulated me sincerely. We exchanged a few pleasant sentences about nothing important, and then we both moved on with our shopping. The whole interaction lasted maybe 2 minutes, but it felt significant because there was no anger or tension left between us. We'd both moved past the drama Lori created and found something better. He seemed content with his new relationship, and I was happy with Elliot. The cheating that felt so devastating on Halloween night had become just a thing that happened, not a wound that still hurt. Standing in my family's bookstore that evening, I looked around at the shelves I'd grown up with and thought about everything that had unfolded here. This was where Lori had walked in holding my mask and claimed to be someone she wasn't. This was where Elliot and I had our first real conversation after Halloween. This was where the truth finally came out, and the lies fell apart. Lori had tried to ensure I'd hurt forever, orchestrating my ex's cheating and stealing my moment with Elliot. She'd wanted me to watch her have what I'd connected with while I stayed broken and alone. But her plan had backfired completely. Instead of destroying me, she'd cleared away a toxic friendship I didn't even realize was poisoning my life. She'd pushed me towards someone who valued honesty and real connection. I'd built stronger friendships with people like Freya who actually celebrated my success. I'd learned to trust my own instincts instead of second-guessing every feeling. The betrayal had hurt deeply, cutting through years of friendship and trust, but it had also led me to something genuine. Sometimes the worst moments really do lead to the best outcomes, not because the pain doesn't matter, but because it forces you to see what was wrong and find something better.